we'll start off with all the things that you need to gather before you're ready to actually start mixing your glaze. And when mixing test glazes, we need quite a few supplies. And I have the list here of all the different things that you should gather and have ready to go right at your workstation, at your table, before you even start to get out any materials or anything. So we have these 16-ounce cups, and there's a bunch of them around the studio. We're going to use them to mix our glaze. We're going to dip our test tiles in them. And then as soon as we're done mixing, we're going to rinse these out and put them back on the glaze shelf, or the glaze material shelf that's over here that I'll show you in a minute. You need 80 mesh sieve. And so that's this sieve right here. We have two of these. They say 80 on them. And the number determines how many holes that you have in this mesh for every square inch. And so 80 holes in a square inch. And so the higher the number of the mesh, the more holes and the smaller the holes are. 80 mesh will be fine for most of our glaze testing that we're doing. And we're going to sieve our glazes so we make sure that they're nice and homogeneous and there aren't any big chunks of material in there. You'll need your respirator or dust mask. I have my respirator here with the P100 filters on them. And we also have a box of dust masks here in the studio, in the Glaze Lab, the disposable N95 masks. You'll often need rubber gloves. The rubber gloves are mostly for when you have different metal oxides that you're weighing out that are colorants in your glazes. And some of those metallic oxides can be harmful when they get into your system. And so if you happen to have like a cut on your finger or something, you wouldn't want to have like cobalt oxide getting into that. And so we'll just wear gloves. Also, sometimes they can be pretty difficult to wash off your hands, so it can be staining. A kitchen fork and a small spoon. I have one of these camping spoons that's both a fork and a spoon, so it allows me to use it as a scoop, and also the fork is good for mixing. Spatula, or like a red rubber rib. Basically, you want something that's soft and flexible, and we're going to use this to push our glaze through the sieve. And you'll want to have a scale. We got two new scales, so we have 3 digital scales in the Glaze Lab here. During COVID, there's only 2 people allowed in the Glaze Lab at any time, so there should be plenty of scales for the 2 people that would be in here mixing at any time. Test tiles. So we need to have our bisque-fired test tiles. So we're all to make at least 25 test tiles. If you haven't gotten those on the shelf to be bisque fired yet, we want to get those on there today so they can come out of the bisque kiln as soon as possible, and we can get our glazes mixed up and applied to the test tiles. You'll want to have an underglaze pencil, or you can have some oxide wash and a small brush. We basically need something that we can write on our test tiles with that will not burn away in the kiln. So we have our underglaze pencil is a really good option for that. You need a measuring cup with some water in it. And we'll want to have, for every batch of test glaze we're mixing up, we'll need at least maybe, half a cup or a cup of water. So, fill up a measuring cup with water here so you have enough ready to work with. And some paper towels. I have paper towels here. I'll use this because I'll be using a scoop or my spoon to get materials out of a container. When I go to switch to my next material, I want to wipe that dry material off of there. I don't want to use a wet sponge or something because I want this to stay dry, because I'm going to be putting it into dry material bins. So paper towels, good for dry cleanup. And you want a calculator. You can use your phone or old school calculator to crunch some numbers. You want to have a notepad and something to write with, so you can have your glaze recipe written down and you can mark things off as you go. And of course, you'll want your glaze recipes. So I'm just going to mix up one glaze recipe today, and I want to make sure that I have all my ingredients for that. So I have my glaze recipe written down here. So I have a glaze recipe that I found on Glazes. I found this glaze, this transparent, teal transparent cone 6. So here it does say 6 to 8. So, you know, we could try test firing it even hotter if we wanted, but I thought this looked nice. Looks like it will really accentuate any texture that I might have on my piece. And here is the recipe. So what we want to do before we start mixing is we want to look at all these different materials. You know, ideally you've gone through and kind of labeled, you know, silica, that's our glass former. The nepheline cyanide is a type of feldspar, so that's a flux. We have a clay here. Clay has all 3 of our different categories in it. Frit is a flux. Elastomite is all calcium, so that's a flux. Then we have our colorants here. So what I want to do is I want to look for all these ingredients. And here in the glaze lab, we have almost every glaze ingredient that you would need for mixing most glazes that we use in studio ceramics. And these are all here in alphabetical order. And they have labels on them. The containers have a paragraph on here that'll give you some information about what they might be used for in different ceramic applications. And so what we want to do is we want to just take an inventory of the different materials in our glaze. So I have silica, nepheline cyanide, also known as Nef-Cy for short. We have EP kaolin, also known as just EPK, Frit 3134, and elastomite. So I'm just going to go back here to the inventory and just make sure that we have all these things. We'll go back to Glazes. So when you're looking at a recipe on Glazes, you can come down here and change the amounts here. For our assignment, we're going to mix up 200-gram test batches. And the reason that we want to mix up 200 grams instead of 100 grams, there's a couple reasons. One is we want to have enough material in our cup, so when we dip our test tile in, it will give us a decent amount of glaze on that test tile. So we want it to be deep enough in here. Also, when weighing out really small amounts of material like our cobalt and copper, you know, cobalt's only 1% because it's really, really strong. So we don't ever use very much cobalt. So weighing 1 gram of material, it's kind of easier that you would weigh a little too much or a little too less, or the scale wouldn't be sensitive enough. So if we double this by making it 200, so I'm going to go down here under batch, I'm going to type 200. And that does all the math for us up here. So we could easily multiply our recipe by 2 and on a piece of paper and do that ourselves. But it's nice that Glazes has the calculator built in for us. So what I'll do is when I mix up the glaze, I'll be using these numbers right here for the grams. So this will equal 200 grams here. So I'm going to weigh out, you know, 52 grams of silica, 49 grams of Nef-Cy, and so on. I like to have all my information on a piece of paper so I can check things off as I go. So I'm actually going to just transpose the numbers from that batch up here. So we have 52 for our silica, 49 grams for Nef-Cy, 41 for EPK, 30 for our Frit, and 28 for elastomite, then 10 for copper, and 2 for cobalt. These will be the amounts that I'm weighing up. All right. So I'll get on my mask and my gloves. The way I go about this is I'll just go one material at a time. I'm going to bring over the container for my first material, which is silica, and I'll weigh those out one by one. Now, with digital scales, if you haven't used one before, these are really simple. Say on is also the button that says tare, and what tare does is I don't want to have to subtract the weight of my container that I'm measuring into. So when I put that on there, it says it's 11 grams. If I hit tare, it goes back to 0. You also want to make sure that the scale is on the right unit. So if we push unit, that goes to pounds, pounds and ounces, ounces, milliliters, grams. So we just want to make sure that we're weighing in the right unit. Got my cup torn, and I have this other cup. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this cup to weigh materials in, and then I'll transfer them into this cup once I know I have the right amount, and then I'll put a new material in my weighing cup and keep adding the materials to this. So by the end, I'll have all my dry materials in one container. All right, so we'll weigh out our silica. We have 52 grams. Now, when you're weighing out these materials, you want to be sure that you're not creating a whole bunch of dust. So you probably know that silica is one of the most dangerous materials that we use in terms of its ability to harm our lungs. So when we're scooping these materials out, we don't want to travel really far with them on the scoops because things might fall. And we also want to kind of drop them from a low distance. So we don't want to drop them from real high or do things that would create dust. So I have 24 grams in there, 37, 51. So I just need one more gram. Now to do that, I put a little bit of material on my scoop, and then I'll just take my finger and tap the scoop and allow a little bit to fall off until I see that number jump from 51 to 52. And there, it's right at 52. I'll put the rest back. Now, if a little bit too much went in there, I would just carefully remove some until it was right at the right number. I'll wipe off my scoop, take this first material, put it into this container, carefully, try not to create a lot of dust, put them upside down, and then I like to flip the top of it to get all that powder to fall down in there. Set that back on there, come back to my recipe, and check off the silica. I'll put the silica back and grab my second ingredient, which is nepheline cyanide. We're just going to repeat these. What's it say on here? Nepheline cyanide, high alumina soda flux. So that means it's a flux, but if it has a lot of alumina in it, it's also a stabilizer. All right. So nepheline cyanide is 49. $42, $48. I'm going to be careful with this last gram. $49. I'll wipe off my scoop. Transfer the neph side. and mark off my nephsi. Now move to the kaolin. And now I'm at the last ingredient in my base glaze. So if you remember, we have our base glaze is everything except for the colorants and the additives. So what we're doing here is we're going to mix up just this base. We're going to add water and then sieve it and then dip a test tile. Then we'll weigh out our two colorants here. We'll add those to that glaze, mix it up, sieve it, and then dip our second test tile. And when we fire those, we'll get information of what this base glaze looks like all on its own, and we'll see what it looks like with a colorant in it. Now this material, I can tell when I look in there, it's pretty, it's pretty grainy. Looks like kind of, you can see like big chunks of material in there. And so this is one of those materials that it's really important that we're going to sieve it, because otherwise those chunks of material wouldn't get distributed evenly in our glaze, and then the glaze wouldn't come out the way that it's supposed to. Oh, well, this is a good example for our demo. My scale just turned off as I was weighing this material. These scales are set up to turn off after they have a certain amount of inactivity. So I just need to start over with this material here. Put my cup back on, tare, and then weigh out that 28 grams again. So now I have my whole base glaze in the cup. Now I'm ready to mix this up. First thing I'll do is mix that base glaze with my fork, dry mix. So I'm just carefully and slowly going to mix these dry materials. I don't want to stir it really vigorously because I don't want to create dust. I don't want to spill anything. With a small amount of material, like 200 grams, accuracy is really, really important. Because if you're off by 1 gram, that's a larger kind of proportion than if you were mixing, you know, say 20 pounds of glaze and you were off by 1 gram. So you want to make sure you don't spill anything, and we keep track of all the different materials. It's nice to work with these clear cups because you can see how well you're mixing things. You can see that there's still some material down at the very bottom that's not getting mixed up. So I'll make sure that I really scoop down towards the bottom. Okay. So now that I've dry mixed that, I'm going to add water. A rule of thumb with your typical glaze is 50 grams of water to start with. And you would use less if you looked at your glaze recipe and didn't see any clay in it. The clay that's in this glaze recipe is the EPK, the Edgar Plastic Kaolin, and it's 20% of the glaze. So that's a pretty significant amount of clay. Clay is really absorbent. It'll absorb a lot of water, much more so than just like the frit or the pure silica. And so the more clay that's in your glaze, the more water it will take to get it to the consistency that the average glaze is. So what I'll do is I'll take my cup that I was weighing things out in, I'll set that on the scale, and I'll just weigh out 50 grams of water. I'm guessing it's probably going to take more than 50 grams, but we'll just start with that. And then I prefer to add the dry material to the water. If you do it the other way around, sometimes you'll get caked powdered material at the bottom of your cup that it doesn't get mixed in as well. So I'm going to add my dry to the wet. And I'll just put it in scoop by scoop here. So I can see that all that water is pretty much absorbed into only about half of my material. So I'll give it a little bit of a mix, and then I'm going to slowly add more water until I get this to the right consistency. And I know that I started with 50. What's good to do is if you're going to mix up a lot of different test batches of the same glaze, is if you keep track of how much water you've added, then you can, the next time you mix up that same glaze, you can just use that amount of water again, and it should be the right amount. So what I'll do is I'll weigh this after I get all the water into it and write down exactly how much water it took. I'll just have to subtract the weight of the dry materials and the weight of the cup, which should be 211 grams. So this is, you know, absorbed. All the dry material is wet, but it's way too thick for us to use as a typical glaze. So I'll still want to add some more water to that. I'm just slowly, a little bit at a time. And a little bit can go a long way. Sometimes it's it'll pretty easily go from too thick to not thick enough. We're looking for, with your typical glaze, looking for like a heavy cream consistency. So your typical, say like utilitarian glaze is usually at that heavy cream consistency. And then some glazes, like textured glazes, glazes that crawl, or I'm trying to think of some others that like to be thick. So typically like a crawling glaze, they want to be thicker, and the thicker they're applied, the more they'll crawl. And then some glazes want to be applied really, really thin. Like I have a glaze called John's Clear that's really good for cone 6 to 10. And that glaze likes to be applied really, really thin. So often you want to look at if there's any special notes with your glaze recipe. They might mention that, the thickness or thinness of the mix. And also it just comes from testing. So if you mix up a glaze and you mix it with just the right amount of water to make it heavy cream consistency, and then when you test it, it doesn't look right, one of the things that you can do is to mix it up with less water and mix it up with more water and test those. Do a thinner and thicker application and see. So this is starting to get to what feels like a good consistency. What I'll do at this point, it's wet enough to go through the sieve. So I'm going to push it through the sieve once. Use my other cup. These fit nicely in these 16-ounce cups. We'll just pour that on there. I'm going to use my spatula to make sure I get all that material out. I like to mix this first mix with a little bit thicker than I think it needs to be. And when I go to transfer this material, I can take a little bit of my water, put in there, and just try to get the rest of that glaze out of there. Then you'll use your spatula or rubber rib and push the glaze through. So what this is doing is it's pushing the materials through the sieve. It's breaking up any large chunks. That elastonite is going to be the thing that really gives us the trouble here. But we should be able to kind of crush all those little chunks of material and push them through the sieve so they'll distribute nicely. throughout the glaze. This is a really essential step. Oftentimes people skip this step, and sometimes you can get away with it and you don't really see a difference, but more often than not, I see examples of where a glaze isn't sieved properly and you have like little chunks of material that sit on the surface once it's fired, or maybe the color isn't distributed very well. I don't know if you guys can see, but as I do this, I can see like white streaks where that elastinite is getting like broken up and pushed through. Again, we just want to make sure we get all this material in here. Once we dip our first base glaze test tile, we want to add the colorants, and we want to make sure that there's the right kind of proportion. So we want to make sure all the material gets into the cup. Then we have to clean out the back side of the sieve too. So we want to make sure we get all that glaze material into our cup here. Side. I'll come in and mix this some more just with my fork. And I'll take a look at the glaze and see if I see any chunks or anything that looks like it's not mixed up. If you see any little bits of glaze material that it doesn't seem really smooth, go ahead and sieve the glaze again. This seems like it looks pretty good to me. The consistency looks good. I'm just looking at it, kind of pulling the fork up and watching it drip off or go through the tines. You can see that it leaves a little bit of glaze between the tines of the fork, but then that kind of quickly comes out. So if it were to just like run through really, really fast and it didn't leave that webbing, then maybe it's a little too thin. Or if it would just sat like thick on the fork, I could think that it was too thick. I am ready to dip my first test tile. So here I have two test tiles. The first one is just going to be my base glaze. So let's say you guys have 5 glazes. You might think of a really simple way of labeling those glazes. So for right now, it could just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's say this is glaze number 1 for me. And it's a base. So maybe I put like 1B. And I'll write that on my test tile in a place where I can read it. 1B. And then I probably want to put a like my initials on it or some distinguishing mark, just in case when it comes out of the kiln, there are 10 test tiles that say 1B on them. So I'll put my initials DJB on here. And then I'm ready to dip my tile. Now there's lots of ways you can apply glaze, right? If you know that you typically paint glaze on, I would suggest painting the glaze onto your test tiles. If you like to spray glaze all the time, spray your test tiles. Basically, apply the glaze in the same way that you would typically apply it, so you get the information that's most usable for you. If you like never dip glaze, then dipping glaze on your test tile isn't going to give you really great information. So, take this fork out of here. Now, when I apply glaze to a test tile, I like to apply 2 thicknesses. So what I'll do is I'll do a quick dip that goes pretty far down on the test tile. I'll wait for that to dry, and then I'll do another dip that's just halfway. So what I'll get is I'll get information of what the glaze looks like with a thinner application and with a thicker application. So I'm going to dip this in all the way. 1, 2, 3. Let that dry. I'm basically waiting to make sure that there isn't any glossy, wet glaze on there. Should only take a minute. And then I'll do a second dip just to here. So you can see there's 2 layers of glaze. This will give me a thinner application, a thicker application. Just trying to get as much information as we can. Let that dry. It takes a little bit longer to dry. Set that aside. Now we're ready to weigh out our colorants and dip another tile in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh out my copper carb and my cobalt carb. Maybe I'll call that 1C because that's the colorants. Making notes in a place where I can find them. You know, keep it all organized so you don't, when your glaze tests come out, if you can't find your notes, then you might not know exactly which glazes they are. So I'm going to get a, now when weighing out really, really small amounts of material, I like to just use a piece of paper instead of a cup or a container. So I'll just get a little square of paper like this. I'll fold a little crease in the corner. That'll be my spout so I can pour that material in. And then I'll just lay that on the scale. We'll get my copper carbonate. So we need 10 grams of copper carbonate. Going to be quite a bit of material here. Went over. So I'll use this piece of paper to drop this material in. Put this away and get my cobalt. Now, oftentimes with these colorants, there are carbonates and oxides. The rule of thumb is that the carbonates are a little weaker than the oxides. So typically an oxide will just give you like a stronger response. They're a slightly different color. We're going to 2 grams. Being really careful because at any moment it'll go over. All right, that's our 2. Close all that back up. Transfer my cobalt. There, get all that off. And now I'm going to mix this again. And I'll probably need to add a little bit of water to it, just because I've added more dry material. Yeah, it seems a little bit thicker. So we'll push it back through the sieve. Add my little bit of extra water. We have our second test tile. I'm going to label it. 1C, DJB. And I'm going to do the same thing where I'll dip it all the way in, and then I'll dip it halfway a second time. All right. So we have our two test tiles. We have this batch of glaze here. There are a couple things you can do. You know, we don't have a million cups. And so if everybody wanted to save all of their test glazes, we would run out of cups pretty quickly. So we may need to just discard of this excess glaze, or if you bring in some of your own cups, you could put a cover on these and store them on your shelf, because you may find that you really like the glaze and you want to use this glaze up. But sometimes there's just an amount of glaze that's like a casualty of the testing process. Typically with excess glaze, we have a glaze waste container in the glaze lab. And then we can collect that glaze waste and dispose of it properly, because there are some heavy metals and materials in here that we don't want to wash down the drain, and we want to dispose of them properly. So what I would do then is I would repeat that for my other 4 glazes. And of course, clean up is a really important step here. So I would, you know, take the little bit of glaze that's on your utensils and stuff, we can wash off in the sink. And we'll take our stuff to the sink, do our dishes, you know, get some clean water, wipe everything down, put all the tools and materials back where we found them. And that's why when I'm mixing glazes, I like to get one material out at a time, weigh it out, and put it away immediately. So then at this point, I just have the tools that I had out that I need to clean. I don't have to now go back and like put all the different containers and things like that away. And you know, if someone else is working in here, it's easier for that other person to find those materials if they're in their rightful home.